Well, good morning, church. I have a story I want to tell you today. So I'm not sure where I heard this story, or if I've told you before, or why I remember it so fondly, or not fondly, but so much. There is, imagine these two little girls coming to their parents, and one of them says, Mom, I saw a creature in my room, and it was fuzzy and furry. And then the mom says, how big is it? They're like, about this big. What do you think? Crazy. Kids and their imaginations. So the parents go, they check it out, and they go and they take a look in the room. There's nothing there. They tell the kids what we always tell our kids. You know, you probably watched something. It's probably too much. Just maybe it was, a shadow. So the little girl says, okay, Mom, I guess so. 3 days later at 3 a.m., their older daughter comes to their room at 3 a.m. and knocks on their door and says, Mom, I saw it too. And the parents are like, what are they watching? And so they get up kind of like in the way that you get up to appease your kids, but you're really resentful because it's 3 a.m. And so you get up, they go in the room, and this is what they come face to face with. See that? An opossum. Now, there are a few reasons why I would want to sell my house. There are a couple of reasons why it's a good idea to change neighborhoods. And I think finding this in my child's room would be at the top of the list. Now, if it was me, like the kids would come out of the room and that would stay in the room. I'd be like, someone else has to go in and get it. Now, sometimes seeing is truly required to believe. Now, I'm not sure if any of you followed the bishop's notes. I'm not sure if I put it in this week's kind of weekly email, but if you read the bishop's notes from this week, he quoted some stats from the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada that said evangelicals consider themselves to add value to the community at a rate of about 74%, but that only 18% of non-evangelicals agree. And in fact, 40% of non-evangelicals think that the church as an institution actually causes harm. Now, those numbers can be seen as telling signs of a changing culture, or they can be telling signs of an institution that can't keep up with the culture. But what if there's another element to the story? What if these statistics demonstrate less about our inability to keep up with culture and more so about our inability to keep up with and respond well to the message of the kingdom? What if our many attempts to relate well to the culture have left us woefully ill-prepared to embody and manifest the message of the kingdom, the message of Jesus? And if this is the case, if the church has chosen to pursue any other thing, any other direction, or any other experience other than that which is reflected in Jesus, then it should not surprise us when neighbors and communities and organizations and families and persons wonder if we have something meaningful and worthwhile and beautiful to offer. And in the midst of church celebrity culture and abuse scandals and institutional protections and conversations about who's in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't, the historical narratives and the present day realities, it's no wonder those around the church are still wondering when our actions will match our words. Sometimes seeing truly is required to believe. And so the question can no longer be about how do we distract them from what they are seeing, How do we change the narrative about what they are witnessing or deny the reality of what they are seeing? Instead, it's time for the church, individual and local and institutional, to live in such a way that those around us can see something worth believing. It's time for us to become who Jesus invites us, forms us, and transforms us to become, because it's in our lived reality, aligning with the call of Jesus, that our actions so outweigh the narrative that we become worthy of being believed. Our words are no longer and may have never been enough. Sometimes seeing is truly required for us to believe. In the book of Hebrews, it says, faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things that we cannot see. And the writer then outlines story after story about men and women who acted in faithful response to God, somehow believing that what God envisioned for them was better than what they were experiencing. That no matter how much closer to the promised land or the promised victory or the promised temple or the promised Messiah they came to, they all believed that even if they didn't see it in their lifetime, that they would live in such a way as though it was already coming to pass. They might not experience, they might not see it, they might not taste it, but they had such belief that their hope inspired them to follow where God was leading. And so despite not receiving what was promised, each name mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 is known for their faithfulness. They're known for their faith. They're known for living into the promise long before the promise comes to fruition. Now, I know that faith language can often be abused and can cause some significant harm. Significantly, when it's translated to say what is actually happening is not happening. And I don't think that the author of Hebrews is suggesting that if one has a cold or a broken arm or a serious illness, that they ought to say, I am well despite what they see and despite what they experience. I don't think that the author was trying to tell us to insist that we are wealthy when we're on the cusp of poverty, or that our child does or doesn't have a specific illness when it's clear that they do. That's probably a very kind of elementary way to look at the word faith. And it can lead to disappointment and anger and confusion about God and the church. And so I am suggesting that the author of Hebrews is less concerned with the tangible and is more interested in the spiritual. And so when I read that faith gives us assurance about things that we cannot see, it reminds me of N.T. Wright when he suggests that we, the church, live life in accordance with the new world we have already entered by faith. Imagine if we truly understood the call of the church to be a people who live in accordance with the new world we have already entered by faith. This new world that Wright speaks of is what Paul writes about and Jesus teaches about, is what we often refer to as the kingdom of God. And so for just a moment, I want us to pause. I want you to imagine how the world would respond to the church if we were a people who lived as though the new world already existed. How would the world respond to a church, to a people, to a family, to a community that is already living as if the reality of the kingdom is among us? And the reality of the kingdom is us. What would shift? What would change? What would we be so busy co-creating around us that goodness not only followed us, but was who we are? Sometimes seeing is truly required to believe. And I like to imagine that this is kind of what Paul is encouraging Timothy to move towards in this morning's passage. Timothy is Paul's, great hope for the church to continue. He's like an example of, if we had more like Timothy, I was that kid. People were like, if we just had like a church full of Keithas, we'd just be fine. So I'm just like Timothy, I guess. But there's those people that you meet along the way, those kind of like fervent and excited to volunteer and excited to kind of give their heart and soul into the church kind of people. And I kind of think that is how Paul viewed Timothy, someone who was so invested, and he just saw like, this is the kind of people we need to invest in for the church to continue. And so he has helped him to further his journey with Jesus. And now Paul is in prison, and he writes to him and he offers him this advice. He says, don't chase after the things that you think the church should be. Don't chase after the temptations of the empire. Don't become consumed by the things that are nothing more than the appearance of success, but are actually just the results of roots tied to the accumulation of more and more. Instead, choose to lean into who Jesus is. In fact, Paul goes on to say, my advice is to run away from those things that, although they are appealing and tempting and deeply connected with our ideas around progress and success and growth within the ways of the empire, within the ways of the powerful, within the ways of the things that we see around us, he says, treat them as if those things are dangerous. As if those things have the capacity to negatively impact who you are as a Christ follower, and thus who the church is in the world. And he says, instead, I want you to run towards those things that help form and shape and transform you and your surroundings to become more like Jesus. Paul says to Timothy, he says, I want you to run towards justice. I want you to run towards godliness. I want you to run towards faith. I want you to run towards love. I want you to run towards perseverance and run towards gentleness. And if we listen closely, it's almost as if Paul is saying, run towards that which is produced by a life cultivated in and connected to the Spirit. And run away from that which is produced by the pursuit of money, the pursuit of the empire, the pursuit of power, the pursuit of control, the pursuit of all things that seem most important and most valuable when our eyes are singularly focused on building that which we can taste and see and touch, rather than focused on building a life that is fruitful, a life that is Spirit-filled, a life that is Spirit-led. Paul gives a hint of what this kind of life looks like, a life that runs towards love and justice and godliness. And he seems to say, to put this kind of life into practice, it requires us to lean into the word generosity, to model the word generosity, to allow generosity to become who we are. Generous to those in need, generous in good works, generous in ensuring how we live is marked by our care and our concern for others, generous in love, generous in justice, generous in forgiveness, generous in faithfulness, generous in gentleness. Choose the way of the kingdom which looks like generosity. And in verse 20, Paul begins to wrap up his letter to Timothy with words that I hope that we can all grab a hold of. Words that I hope that can help to transform the way that we engage this week. He says, guard what God has entrusted to you. Guard what God has entrusted to you. What has God entrusted to this space? What has God entrusted to you as individuals and families, as a part of this community? Well, I think that God has entrusted to our congregation this neighborhood. I think God has entrusted to us one another and the community groups and organizations that surround us. And so we are compelled, and I am compelled to build something better. to run towards love, to run towards gentleness, to run towards a life that seeks to be generous, to run towards a life that participates in the co-creation of a more just world, to be a people and a church and a community that insists we can cultivate something worth seeing, something worth believing. But as a church community, it's not enough for me to run towards love. It's not enough for me to seek out generosity or for me to cultivate something worth seeing and believing. It requires the fullness of the community to bring to life that which is worthy of seeing and that which is worthy of believing. And so together we show and we preach and we sing and we serve and we learn and we engage as we seek to be a people who generously live life in accordance with a new world we have already entered by faith. A world that's more equitable, a world that is motivated by love, a world that's fueled by compassion, a world that seeks justice as an act of righteousness, a world that insists the last will be first and the first will be last. And this new world, the one we are called to embody by faith, is among us and has the capacity to become us. A church courageous enough to insist that sometimes seeing is truly required to believe. I'm going to ask